Council Speaker Veltar walked into the great chamber on Nexus Prime like he had done every day for the past 20 years, and something felt wrong, but he could not place what it was at first. The massive hall with its 1,000 seats arranged in perfect circles still looked the same, with representatives from 47 different species sitting in their assigned places, discussing trade routes and mining rights and border disputes like always. But as his 6 eyes scanned the familiar rows, he noticed gaps where there should have been people, and not just any people, but specific ones that had been there yesterday and the day before that, and every day for decades. The humans section stood, empty, and not just empty like when someone was sick or away on business, but completely cleared out with no nameplates and no personal items and no signs that anyone had ever sat there at all. Ambassador Kim Dae-ho, who always arrived early with his stack of papers and quiet smile, was nowhere to be seen, and his desk had been stripped clean. Dr. Park Sojin, who usually sat in the science advisory section typing notes on her small computer, was gone, and her chair had been pushed under the table like someone had cleaned up after a meeting. Colonel Lee Wanbin, who stood guard near the military planning area, had vanished, and even his security post looked abandoned. Veltar called his assistant over with a gesture of his main arm and asked where the humans were, and the young Kreksani looked confused and said he did not know but would check the daily attendance records. When he came back 5 minutes later, his face showed the same confusion, and he reported that according to the computer systems, no humans had checked in today and no one had called in sick or requested leave. It was as if they had simply decided not to come to work without telling anyone. This made no sense because the humans were always very careful about following rules and procedures, and they never missed important meetings without sending word ahead of time. Ambassador Kim had been working on the new trade agreement with the Mordesh Federation for 3 months and was supposed to present his final report today. Dr. Park had been leading a research project into the energy problems affecting Outer Rim colonies, and Colonel Lee was scheduled to brief the Council on security concerns along the border regions. Veltar decided to contact the human embassy directly, but when he tried to call the main number, he got an automated message saying the line was temporarily out of service. He sent an aide to walk over to the embassy building, which was only 2 blocks away from the council chambers. But the aide came back 20 minutes later looking puzzled and reported that the building was dark and locked with a sign on the door, saying it was closed for maintenance. Something was definitely wrong, so Veltar called an emergency session of the council leadership, and within an hour, 12 of the most senior representatives were gathered in the small meeting room behind the main chamber. He explained what he had observed and asked if anyone else had noticed anything unusual about the humans recently. Councillor Thexmore from the Trade Federation said he had tried to reach Chief Financial Officer Han Sora yesterday about some shipping contracts, but her office said she was unavailable. Defense Minister Keklon mentioned that he had not seen any human military personnel at the morning briefing, which was unusual because they always attended. The Velkari intelligence chief, who rarely spoke in meetings, raised one of her 4 hands and said she had been monitoring communication traffic from all member species as part of routine security protocols and had noticed that human transmissions had dropped to almost 0 over the past 3 days. When pressed for details, she explained that normally the humans sent hundreds of messages daily between their various colonies and outposts and government offices, but since Tuesday, the traffic had been practically silent except for automated system updates. This information sent a chill through the room because it suggested that whatever was happening was not limited to just the representatives on Nexus Prime, but might involve all human territories. Veltar immediately ordered a full investigation and dispatched teams to check every human facility on the planet, while also sending emergency communications to human colonies and outposts throughout Council space. The results came back over the next 6 hours, and each report was more disturbing than the last. The human residential district on Nexus Prime was completely empty, with apartments cleared out and personal belongings gone as if the occupants had moved away permanently. The human research facility that employed 300 scientists was abandoned, with all equipment shut down and data banks wiped clean. Even the small human restaurant that many council members visited for lunch was closed, with a simple note taped to the window saying "Thank you for your business." The reports from other worlds were equally baffling. On Kepler Station, which served as a major human trading post, the docks were empty and the warehouses had been cleared out. On New Sol Colony, which housed 2 million human civilians, the entire population had vanished, leaving behind empty cities and farmlands with crops still growing in the fields. On Firebase Alpha, which protected the Outer Rim from pirates, the human garrison had departed, taking all their ships and weapons with them. What made the situation even more mysterious was how quietly and efficiently it had been done. There were no signs of panic or hurried evacuation, and no evidence of any external threat that might have forced the humans to leave. Their facilities had been shut down properly, with all safety systems activated and waste disposal completed. Their financial accounts had been closed and all outstanding debts paid. Even their library books had been returned and their parking permits canceled. The only clue came from the automated systems that had been left running, and when the technical teams examined the computer networks, they found a series of messages that had been sent to every member species government exactly 72 hours earlier. The message was brief and formal and read simply, "Contract fulfilled. Thank you for the opportunity." It was signed with the official seal of the Human Federation Council and marked as a final communication. Veltar stared at the message on his screen and felt a growing sense of dread because he was starting to remember something that had been buried in bureaucratic files decades ago. When the humans first joined the Galactic Council, they had not signed the standard permanent membership agreement that bound species to the Federation forever. Instead, they had negotiated a 50-year trial period that would allow either side to end the relationship if it was not working out. He called his secretary and asked her to pull the original human membership documents from the archives, and when she brought them to his office an hour later, his worst fears were confirmed. Buried in the fine print of the agreement was a clause stating that either the Human Federation or the Galactic Council could terminate the relationship with 30 days' notice after the 50-year trial period expired, and according to the dates on the contract, that trial period had ended exactly 3 days ago. The humans had not broken any laws or violated any agreements. They had simply chosen not to renew their membership and had quietly departed in accordance with the terms they had negotiated half a century earlier. They had given the required 30 days' notice through proper diplomatic channels and had fulfilled all their obligations before leaving. The fact that no one on the council had remembered or paid attention to the expiration date was not their problem. As Veltar sat in his office late that night, staring out at the empty human district, he began to realize that the Galactic Council had just made the biggest mistake in its 1,000-year history. The emergency session of the full Galactic Council convened at dawn, and Veltar had never seen the Great Chamber so tense, with 47 species representatives talking in worried whispers, while their aides rushed back and forth carrying reports and data tablets. The empty human section looked like a missing tooth in an otherwise perfect smile, and everyone kept glancing at those vacant seats as if expecting the humans to walk in at any moment with apologies and explanations. Veltar called for order and began explaining what they had discovered about the human departure. But before he could finish speaking, Counselor Prime Zethros interrupted him with a voice that carried barely controlled panic. The Thexari leader had spent the entire night reviewing financial records, and what he had found made his scales turn pale with fear. According to his calculations, the humans had been contributing 40% of the Council's total military defense budget and 60% of their advanced research funding for the past 2 decades. The numbers got worse as Zethros continued. Reading from his tablet, human colonies produced 35% of the rare Earth elements that powered Council technology, including the quantum crystals that made faster-than-light travel possible. Human manufacturing facilities built most of the computer systems and communication arrays used throughout Council space. Human engineers maintained the massive space stations and orbital platforms that served as trade hubs for the entire galactic. Economy Defense Minister Keklon stood up with his fur bristling and demanded to know how this had happened without anyone noticing, but the answer was simple and embarrassing. The humans had been so efficient and reliable that everyone had taken their contributions for granted. When Ambassador Kim Dae-ho submitted budget reports, they were filed away without being read carefully. When Chief Engineer Choi Min-ho proposed new infrastructure projects, they were approved automatically because human engineering was always excellent. When Dr. Park So-jin published research papers, they were accepted without peer review because human science was consistently groundbreaking. The intelligence chief pulled up historical records on the main display screen and showed the council just how much they had been depending on human expertise without realizing it. The defensive grid that protected Council space from external threats had been designed and built by Colonel Lee Wanbin's engineering corps. The early warning systems that detected incoming asteroids and hostile ships were maintained by human technicians. Even the environmental systems on Nexus Prime that kept the air breathable for all species had been upgraded and improved by human scientists. What made the situation even more humiliating was the discovery that the Council had been systematically dismissing and ignoring human advice for decades. When strategic advisor Han So-ra had warned about growing pirate activity in the Outer Rim 2 years ago, the Council had called her concerns exaggerated. When Dr. Yu Jin-woo had proposed new medical treatments for the spreading void plague, his research had been labeled premature. When military analyst Lee Soo-jin had suggested improvements to fleet tactics, her ideas had been dismissed as too aggressive. The archives were full of human proposals that had been buried in committee or voted down by representatives who thought they knew better. Technology upgrades that could have saved lives had been rejected because they came from humans. Trade agreements that would have benefited everyone had been blocked because some species did not want to appear dependent on human innovation. Military strategies that could have prevented conflicts had been ignored because the Council preferred traditional approaches. Counselor Mexi Vera from the Scientific Alliance pulled up Dr. Park So-jin's personnel file, and what she read made everyone in the chamber uncomfortable. Dr. Park had been the leading expert on quantum physics in known space, with 17 groundbreaking discoveries to her credit, but she had never been promoted to department head because the position was traditionally held by a Velkari scientist. She had trained dozens of alien researchers and shared her knowledge freely, but had been excluded from the most important research projects because humans were considered junior partners. The pattern was the same throughout every department and every level of government. Humans doing the work and providing the expertise while being treated as second-class members who should be grateful for the opportunity to serve. Ambassador Kim Dae-ho had negotiated some of the most successful trade deals in Council history, but had never been invited to join the inner circle of senior diplomats. Colonel Lee Wanbin had designed defensive strategies that had prevented 3 wars, but had been passed over for promotion to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The financial records painted an even grimmer picture of exploitation and neglect. Human colonies paid the highest taxes of any member species but received the lowest levels of infrastructure investment. Human businesses were charged premium rates for trading licenses, while alien corporations got discounts. Human students were accepted to Council universities but were required to pay full tuition, while other species received subsidies. Chief Financial Officer Han So-ra had submitted dozens of reports over the years documenting these inequities and proposing solutions, but her recommendations had been filed away and forgotten. She had warned that the economic imbalance was unsustainable and that humans were being forced to subsidize the entire Council system while getting little in return. Her final report, submitted 6 months ago, had been titled Economic Dependencies and Systemic Inequities, but no one had bothered to read it as the day wore on and more information came to light. The Council members began to understand the true scope of their mistake. The humans had not just been useful contributors to the galactic community. They had been the foundation that everything else was built on. Their technology kept the lights on and the ships flying. Their military expertise kept everyone safe from external threats. Their economic activity generated the wealth that funded social programs and infrastructure projects throughout Council space. The younger species representatives started asking uncomfortable questions about why no one had noticed, how integral humans had become to everything the Council did, why their contributions had been consistently undervalued despite being essential, why their voices had been ignored when they tried to warn about problems and propose solutions, why the most advanced species in the galaxy had been treated like junior partners who should be grateful for scraps. Veltar tried to maintain order, but the chamber was descending into chaos as representatives demanded answers and accountability. Some species were already calculating how much they would lose without human support, while others were trying to figure out if their own territories could survive the economic disruption. A few of the military representatives were quietly discussing whether they had enough ships and weapons to defend their borders without human assistance. The session finally ended when Counselor Prime Zethros collapsed at his podium from stress and exhaustion. As medical teams carried him away, the remaining representatives sat in stunned silence, staring at the empty human section and finally understanding what they had lost. The humans had not just left the Council, they had taken the future with them. The first crisis hit just 8 days after the humans departed, when the Crexani Trade Federation announced that their economy was in complete collapse. Trade Minister Vexdal stood before an emergency economic council session with his normally confident demeanor replaced by barely controlled panic as he explained that 70% of their interstellar shipping contracts had been with human colonies, and overnight, those routes had become worthless empty space with no cargo to transport and no destinations to reach. The shipping lanes that had made the Crexani wealthy for generations were now ghost routes, where massive cargo vessels drifted aimlessly because their human customers had vanished along with the goods they produced and the raw materials they purchased. Entire fleets of transport ships were being recalled to Crexani ports, where they sat idle burning money on maintenance and crew wages while generating no income. Thousands of Crexani families who had worked in shipping for generations found themselves unemployed with no prospects for future work. The manufacturing sector was hit even harder because Crexani factories had been producing components and finished goods specifically designed for human markets. Their assembly lines were tooled for human specifications, and their quality control systems were calibrated to human standards. Without human buyers, these products were useless because no other species wanted or needed them, warehouse after warehouse, filled with inventory that could not be sold, while the factories that produced them shut down one by one. But the economic disaster was just the beginning of the Council's problems, and the real catastrophe started 2 weeks later when the Mordesh defense grid began experiencing system failures throughout their territory. Chief Engineer Cosmore contacted Nexus Prime with reports that defensive satellites were going offline and automated weapons platforms were shutting down for unknown reasons. When technical teams investigated, they discovered that the entire grid had been maintained and upgraded by human engineers led by Chief Technical Officer Lim Haijin. The maintenance protocols and diagnostic systems were so complex that only humans understood how they worked, and without human expertise, the Mordesh had no way to keep their defenses operational. Critical components started failing one after another, and replacement parts were impossible to obtain because they had been manufactured exclusively in human facilities. Within a month, the Mordesh military found themselves virtually defenseless against external threats for the first time in 50 years. The medical crisis began almost simultaneously when the void plague that Dr. Shin Ye-jin had been researching suddenly spread to 3 new star systems in the outer rim. The plague was a mysterious disease that affected multiple species in different ways, and human researchers had been the only ones making progress toward understanding its transmission patterns and developing treatments. Without their unique biological resistance studies and their advanced research facilities, the Council's medical response was woefully inadequate. Dr. Shin had been working with a team of human biologists to map the genetic markers that made some individuals immune to the plague. While others succumbed quickly, her research had identified several promising treatment approaches, and she had been preparing to begin clinical trials when the humans departed. The computer systems containing her research data had been wiped clean before the evacuation, and the specialized laboratory equipment had been taken with them as the plague spread unchecked through populations that had never developed natural resistance. The death toll began climbing rapidly. Hundreds of thousands died in the first month alone, while Council medical teams struggled to understand what they were dealing with. The treatment protocols that Dr. Shin had developed were lost, and attempts to recreate her research from incomplete records failed repeatedly. Entire worlds went into quarantine as panicked governments tried to prevent further spread. The most humiliating crisis came when the Council's flagship dreadnought Unity's Pride suffered a complete systems failure while on a diplomatic mission to the Beta sector. The massive vessel, which served as a symbol of Council power and unity, had been secretly retrofitted with human technology by Captain Park Ji-hoon's engineering corps, who had quietly upgraded its engines and defensive systems over the past decade. Without human maintenance protocols and replacement parts, the ship's advanced systems began failing one by one, starting with the faster-than-light drive, which left the vessel stranded in deep space. Then the life support system started malfunctioning, forcing the evacuation of non-essential personnel. Finally, the artificial gravity generators shut down completely, turning the pride of the Council fleet into a floating tomb where 50,000 diplomats and crew members waited helplessly for rescue. The rescue operation itself became another embarrassment when it was discovered that most of the Council's deep space rescue ships also depended on human technology and could not operate effectively without human crews. It took 6 weeks to jury-rig enough vessels to evacuate everyone from Unity's Pride, and by then the story had spread throughout the galaxy, making the Council look weak and incompetent. As word of these disasters spread, the younger member species began questioning everything they had been told about Council leadership and galactic politics. Why had no one noticed that humans were essential to so many critical systems? Why had the Council allowed itself to become so dependent on a single species while treating that species as junior partners? Why had human warnings about potential problems been ignored when those warnings turned out to be accurate? The Aldari Collective, which had joined the Council only 20 years earlier, started holding public debates about whether their membership was worth the cost. Their representatives pointed out that they were paying substantial fees and taxes to support a council that could not even maintain its own infrastructure without human help. Younger Aldari politicians argued that their species would be better off forming direct trade relationships with remaining council members rather than working through the bureaucratic council system. Similar movements started developing among other newer member species who had joined the Council expecting competent leadership and effective government, but were instead watching everything fall apart. The Nexari Republic threatened to withdraw from several joint defense agreements after learning that their border security depended on human-maintained early warning systems that no longer functioned. The Zentai Federation announced they were suspending their financial contributions until the Council could demonstrate basic competency. The older established species tried to maintain order and confidence, but even they were struggling with the reality of their situation. Without human economic activity, the Council's budget was facing massive shortfalls that would require either dramatic spending cuts or significant tax increases. Without human military expertise, their defensive capabilities were reduced to pre-industrial levels in many sectors. Without human technological innovation, their scientific research programs were decades behind schedule. Veltar found himself working 18-hour days trying to manage crisis after crisis while dealing with increasingly hostile representatives who blamed him for not preventing the human departure. His own staff was overwhelmed and demoralized as they watched the government they had served faithfully for years crumble around them. Emergency sessions were called almost daily, but no one had solutions for problems that required human expertise to solve. The final blow came when several aggressive neighbor species who had been kept in check by Council military power began probing the borders and claiming territory. Without the defensive grids and early warning systems that humans had maintained, the Council could not detect these incursions until it was too late to respond effectively. Worlds that had been secure for generations suddenly found themselves under threat from raiders and pirates who knew the Council could no longer protect them. 3 months after the human departure, the Galactic Council launched the largest search operation in its 1,000-year history, with Admiral Kextar leading a fleet of 200 ships to sweep through every star system in known space, looking for any trace of where the humans had gone. The operation consumed almost half of the Council's remaining military budget, but the leadership was desperate to find humanity and negotiate their return before the entire galactic civilization collapsed. The search teams found nothing at first, which was itself deeply disturbing because humans had lived on hundreds of worlds and operated thousands of facilities throughout Council space. Yet they had vanished so completely that not even debris or energy signatures remained. It was as if an entire species had simply been erased from existence, leaving behind only empty buildings and unanswered questions about how such a massive evacuation could have been accomplished so quietly. Admiral Kextar reported back to Nexus Prime every few days with increasingly frustrated updates about systems that should have contained human colonies but were completely abandoned, space stations that had been operated by human crews but were now running on automated systems, mining operations that had employed thousands of human workers but showed no signs of recent activity. The Admiral had expected to find at least some clues about where the humans had gone, but instead found only perfectly cleaned facilities that revealed nothing. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source when a routine patrol in the Outer Rim detected a faint distress signal coming from a research station that had been thought abandoned. When the rescue team arrived, they found Dr. Nam Hyun-soo, a human scientist who had been conducting deep space research on quantum anomalies and had somehow missed the evacuation because his station was too far from any major shipping routes for Regular communication, Dr. Nam was the first human anyone had seen since the departure, and when Admiral Kextar interviewed him, the scientist seemed genuinely surprised to learn that his entire species had left Council space. He had been working alone for 6 months on a project to map gravitational distortions in nearby star systems, and his last contact with other humans had been a routine supply delivery that was now 3 months overdue. He had assumed the delay was due to bureaucratic problems, not a complete evacuation. When Admiral Kextar asked Dr. Nam if he knew where his people might have gone, the scientist looked confused and said he had no idea because, as far as he knew, humans were happy working with the Council and had no plans to leave. But as they talked, and the Admiral explained what had happened, Dr. Nam's expression gradually changed from confusion to understanding, and finally to what looked almost like embarrassment. Dr. Nam admitted that he had been somewhat isolated from human society during his research, but he was aware that many of his colleagues had been working on projects that seemed more advanced than anything the Council possessed. When he visited human facilities during supply runs, he had noticed technology that looked decades ahead of what other species were using, but he had assumed it was just normal human innovation and had not thought much about it. The real revelation came when Dr. Nam offered to show Admiral Kextar some of the research data he had been collecting. When they accessed his computer systems, the Admiral discovered that the human scientist had been studying star charts and gravitational maps that extended far beyond the borders of Council space into regions that were supposed to be unexplored and uninhabitable. According to Dr. Nam's data, there were stable solar systems and potentially habitable worlds in areas that Council science claimed were empty void. Dr. Nam explained that his research had been part of a larger human project to map the galactic structure and identify new areas for potential expansion. He had been told it was theoretical work designed to help the Council plan for future growth. But looking at his data now, it was obvious that the humans had been conducting practical surveys for colonization. The gravitational anomalies he had been studying were actually navigation markers that would allow ships to travel safely through regions that Council science considered impassable. When Admiral Kextar asked how long humans had been conducting this secret research, Dr. Nam checked his files and found records going back more than 20 years. Dozens of human scientists had been working on different aspects of the project, including Captain Ju Dong-min, who had led what were officially described as exploratory missions, but were actually detailed surveys of potential colony sites. Engineer Lee Soo-jin, whose theoretical research had apparently produced faster than light drives that could navigate the dangerous regions between galaxies. The most shocking discovery came when Dr. Nam accessed his personal communications and found messages from colleagues describing technological breakthroughs that made Council science look primitive. Dr. Kim Jae-hoon had developed quantum computers that could process information at speeds that seemed impossible. Dr. Song Mi-young had created energy systems that could power entire worlds using resources that other species had not even discovered. Captain Lee Dong-wook had built starships with capabilities that exceeded anything in the Council fleet. As Dr. Nam shared more information, Admiral Kextar began to understand that the humans had not just been participating in Council civilization. They had been secretly advancing far beyond it. While other species had been content to use technology that was centuries old, humans had been quietly developing innovations that would revolutionize space travel and planetary development. They had been preparing for expansion into regions of the galaxy that other species did not even know existed. The final piece of the puzzle came when Dr. Nam mentioned that several of his colleagues had talked about making contact with advanced civilizations in distant galaxies. According to conversations he had overheard, humans had discovered that the known galaxy was just a small part of a much larger community of intelligent species. There were ancient networks of civilizations that spanned multiple galaxies and used technologies that made faster-than-light travel look like primitive rocket engines. Dr. Nam showed Admiral Kextar communication logs that contained fragments of conversations about alliance offers and membership invitations from species that had science and technology thousands of years ahead of anything the Council possessed. According to these logs, humans had been approached by representatives of galactic federations that made the Council look like a collection of primitive tribes. They had been offered opportunities to join communities where their innovations would be valued rather than dismissed. Admiral Kextar realized with growing horror that the humans had not just left the Council. They had graduated to a higher level. of galactic civilization. While the Council had been treating them as junior partners, humans had been developing relationships with species so advanced that Council technology would seem like stone tools in comparison. They had been preparing for decades to make the transition from Council space to something far more sophisticated. When Admiral Kextar asked Dr. Nam if he wanted to rejoin his people, the scientist smiled sadly and said he would like to. But he had no idea how to contact them or where they had gone. The communication protocols and navigation data that would allow him to follow them had been classified above his security level, and he had never been told the details of the evacuation plan. He was stranded in Council space with no way to reach the advanced civilizations that his species had joined. Dr. Nam did offer to share his research data with the Council in hopes that it might help them understand what they had lost and perhaps develop their own technology to a level where they could someday rejoin the galactic community. But when Admiral Kextar looked at the equations and technical specifications, he realized that Council science was centuries away from understanding even the basic principles involved. The humans had been so far ahead that their departure had left everyone else in the technological equivalent of the Stone Age. 6 months after humanity's departure, the Galactic Council's territory had shrunk by 40% as member species either withdrew voluntarily or were conquered by aggressive neighbors who had quickly realized that the once mighty Federation could no longer defend itself. What had been the largest and most powerful political organization in known space was now a collection of struggling worlds trying desperately to maintain the technology and infrastructure that humans had built for them. The economic collapse was total and irreversible, because the Council had been dependent on human innovation for so long that they had forgotten how to maintain their own civilization. Without human engineers, the orbital platforms that served as trade hubs began falling out of orbit one by one. Without human technicians, the communication networks that connected distant worlds started failing, leaving entire sectors isolated. Without human scientists, the medical facilities that treated exotic diseases could no longer function properly. Veltar found himself presiding over the dissolution of everything he had worked for his entire life as species after species announced their withdrawal from the Council and made separate peace deals with invading forces. The Krexani Trade Federation was absorbed into the hegemony after their defense fleet was destroyed in a battle that lasted less than 6 hours. The Mordesh military surrendered 3 core worlds to raiders who knew their defensive grids were offline. The Aldari Collective simply declared independence and closed their borders to all Council ships. The final humiliation came when Admiral Kextar reported that the Council's remaining military forces had been reduced to using obsolete weapons and ships that were falling apart faster than they could be repaired. Without human maintenance protocols and replacement parts, the fleet that had once numbered in the thousands was down to fewer than 50 operational vessels, most of which were assigned to escort duty for refugee ships fleeing conquered territories. It was during this dark period that Veltar received a transmission on an old human frequency that had not been used since the evacuation. The message was brief and came from Admiral Song Min Jung, who had been the human fleet commander before the departure. Her words were polite but devastating as she thanked the Council for showing humanity what they were truly worth and mentioned that their new alliance partners valued contribution over politics and innovation over tradition. The transmission included coordinates, but not for negotiation or trade talks. Instead, Admiral Song was showing the Council the location of humanity's new home as a final demonstration of how far they had fallen behind. The coordinates pointed to a sector of space that Council science claimed was uninhabitable, but the transmission included sensor data showing a thriving civilization with technology that made Council achievements look like primitive experiments. The data revealed orbital cities larger than entire Council worlds, powered by energy sources that produced more power than the Council's biggest reactors. It showed starships that could cross galactic distances in days rather than months, using propulsion systems based on principles that Council scientists did not understand. It displayed defensive networks that could protect entire star systems from any conceivable threat using weapons that manipulated space and time itself. Most impressive of all was the information about humanity's new alliance partners, which included 12 different species with combined knowledge and technology that was centuries ahead of anything the Council possessed. These civilizations had been exploring and developing for thousands of years, while Council species had been content to maintain the status quo. They had networks of trade and communication that spanned multiple galaxies and included hundreds of member worlds. Admiral Song's message explained that humanity had been approached by representatives of this advanced alliance 3 years earlier and had been invited to join after demonstrating their potential for innovation and growth. The alliance valued species that could contribute new ideas and technologies rather than those who simply maintained existing systems. They were looking for partners who could help push the boundaries of science and exploration rather than bureaucrats who were afraid of change. The humans had spent 2 years preparing for the transition by secretly developing the technology and knowledge they would need to function at the alliance's level. While the Council had been dismissing their proposals and ignoring their warnings, humans had been working with alliance mentors to advance their science by centuries. They had been building the ships and equipment they would need for their new life while maintaining their obligations to the Council until their contract expired. The message concluded with Admiral Song wishing the Council well and expressing hope that someday they might develop enough to be considered for alliance membership themselves. But she made it clear that their current level of technology and political organization would not qualify them for even preliminary discussions. They would need to advance dramatically in both science and social structure before they could be taken seriously by the galactic community. 3 months later, the Galactic Council held its final session with only 12 species remaining as members and most of those preparing to withdraw as soon as they could arrange alternative security arrangements. Veltar announced the formal dissolution of the government that had lasted for 1,000 years and acknowledged that they had failed to recognize the value of their most important members until it was too late. Some of the remaining species attempted to contact humanity's new alliance and request membership, but their applications were politely declined with explanations that their technological and social development was insufficient for consideration. The alliance representatives suggested that they focus on advancing their own civilizations and perhaps reapply in a few centuries when they had made more progress. The younger species that had joined the Council expecting competent leadership and protection found themselves abandoned to face external threats with obsolete technology and inadequate resources. Many of them fragmented into smaller groups or were absorbed by more aggressive neighbors who had been waiting for the Council's protection to collapse. Within a year, most of Council space had been claimed by various powers that had no interest in maintaining the democratic ideals that had once defined galactic civilization. Dr. Nam Hyun Soo, who had been stranded by the human evacuation, spent his remaining years trying to teach Council scientists the basic principles behind human technology, but found that the gap was too large to bridge. The equations and concepts that humans had developed required an understanding of physics and mathematics that would take generations for other species to acquire. Even with his help, they could only create crude imitations of human innovations. In the ruins of Nexus Prime, a memorial was erected where the human embassy had once stood, with an inscription written by the last Council Secretary Kim Tae-jin before he too departed to join his people in their new alliance. The words were simple, but captured the tragedy of what had been lost through arrogance and neglect. They gave us everything we gave them, nothing they chose wisely. The inscription served as a warning to future civilizations about the dangers of taking loyalty and contribution for granted, but there were few left in Council space who could read it or understand its meaning. The galaxy had moved on to new configurations of power and influence, while the ruins of the old Council served as a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is underestimate the value of those who serve you faithfully.